Good morning. This is Michelle Demert, and I am the Law and Policy Consultant for the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center. We welcome you today and for the Tribal Consultation VAWA 2013 Section 903 that will be held on August 2nd, 2019. I would like to introduce our presenters today. Before we get started, we are very fortunate to have Tammy Truitt-Giroux, a mother of 4 children and 5 grandchildren, who works for the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center as the Executive Director. She has a bachelor's degree in social work and a master's in community psychology. Her work has been in Indian child protection, domestic violence, sexual assault, counseling, advocacy, mental health counseling, addictions, and many other areas. She has worked mostly in the remote village of Anvik for the past 24 years, but is recently splitting her time between Anvik and Fairbanks. Thank you, Tammy, for being present today and participating. Shirley Moses. Shirley is an Inupiaq Eskimo born in Nome, Alaska, and is tribal affiliation is with the Sitnasuk Native Corporation, Bering Straits Native Corporation. She has a master's in education administration and has 20 years experience working in the behavioral health field in various positions. She has experience with coordinating care in the school, behavioral health, and community settings for dually diagnosed youth and adults. Shirley also has worked for a statewide domestic violence sexual assault coalition as program assistant, shelter director, coordinated statewide regional and village SADV training and response, and is a certified SART responder. Shirley is currently the executive director for Healing Native Hearts Coalition. Thank you, Shirley, for joining us today. Next, we have Paula Julian, who serves as a policy specialist for the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center, the National Indian Resource Center addressing domestic violence and safety for Indian women. Paula assists with policy analysis and development, technical assistance and training, and development of partnerships to strengthen laws, policies, and responses addressing violence against women. Formerly, Paula was with the Sacred Circle providing TA to tribal governments and organizations on this issue. And also prior to that, Paula spent 11 years at the Office on Violence Against Women, U.S. Department of Justice. And finally, we have myself, who, Michelle Demert. I'm Tlingit Eagle Kahutsit-Hiton and current delegate and Chief Justice for the Central Council Tlingit and Haida Indian Tribes of Alaska, and where I have devoted the last 25 years of my professional legal career to advancing domestic violence protections for women and children. And I work as the law and policy consultant for the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center. We also have Candy Keown, who is our communications director, and I'm going to turn it over to her to describe the webinar specifics today. Thank you, Candy.
Good morning, everyone. So thank you for joining today's webinar. There's a few different housekeeping items we wanted to cover with you before we get started. So if you take a look on the right side of your screen, you'll see the Go to Webinar Control Panel. So within that control panel, there are 3 sections that I want to bring to your attention. The first is the questions section. You should use that section to ask us any questions you may have during the webinar. All questions typed into that box will come back to us, and we'll provide these to the presenters at the appropriate time, and we'll attempt to answer all questions either during a question and answer session or via email. Second section is the audio section. If you're experiencing bad audio at any time during the webinar, open that section, select the phone option for several seconds, and then click back to the computer audio. That will force the control panel to obtain a new audio connection for you. And if you're still having issues, keep it selected on phone and then dial the number that's shown to connect to the audio portion of the webinar over your telephone. The third section I'd like to highlight is the handout section. In that section, you'll find slides being shown as an available download on PDF. It is not in there yet, but we're working on getting it in to that section. And if not, then we will send it out via email to anyone who's interested after the webinar. So today's webinar is being recorded and will be shared on our website and social media feeds later today or tomorrow, depending on how long the download takes to get converted by the system. If you haven't yet, be sure to sign up for our mailing list and follow us on Facebook and Twitter. And other than that, thank you guys for joining us today, and I hope you enjoy the presentation.
Thank you so much, Candy. Before we get started, I just want to reaffirm the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center's mission statement. We are dedicated to strengthening local tribal governments' responses through community organizing efforts, advocating for the safety of women and children in our communities and homes, especially against domestic and sexual abuse and violence. Through the voices, language, and teaching of tribes, survivors, and advocates, and in partnership with our allies and other stakeholders, the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center provides a voice at the local, statewide, national, and international levels for life-saving changes in laws, policies, and social norms. The Alaska Native Women's Resource Center envisions our tribal women, communities, and families free from violence, healing the trauma, and utilizing the wisdom of our ancestors to create effective community tribal responses to domestic violence, dating violence, stalking, trafficking, sexual assault, and related injustices. So with that, I just would like to welcome you all once again, and I'm going to turn it over to Shirley now to begin our presentation.
Welcome, everyone. Good morning. We're going to cover the information for the 14th Annual Government to Government Violence Against Women Tribal Consultation. And it's going to be held on August 21st and 22nd at the Four Winds Resort of Pokagon Band of the Potawatomi Indians in New Buffalo, Michigan. And we hope to see a lot of you there. There's a couple of pictures. The 2013 consultation was held in DC, Washington, DC. 2014 was held in Rapid City, South Dakota. And the 2015 was held in Washington State.
Yeah.
Candy, can you move those forward, please?
Move what forward? The slide?
Yes, please.
Paula?
Thank you, everybody. So again, my name is Paula Julian, and I'm a Senior Policy Specialist with the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center, which is a partner sister organization to the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center. So what I'm going to cover today a little bit is what tribal consultation is, and the purpose behind consultation in the next two slides. So consultation really is rooted in understanding that tribal governments pre-existed the United States, and as such, before the U.S. was formed, and in 1776, when the United States became its own country, there was that commitment from the very beginning to function on a government-to-government basis between the federal U.S. government and Indian tribal governments, nations. And so that's sort of the foundation behind what we're talking about today in terms of the Violence Against Women annual consultations that have been law since 2005, when the Violence Against Women Act was reauthorized in its second reauthorization. So it became law, Violence Against Women became law in 1994, and every 5 years it was reauthorized because of funding attached to it. And in 2005, tribes, survivors, and Native women's advocates worked with their lawmakers to write in this piece of law in the Violence Against Women Act. So if you go to, if you have the Safety for Native Women, Violence Against Women Act and American Indian Tribes book, which we may have a picture of it at some point in the PowerPoint, but if not, we can send you the, we may have a link to it on the last slide. But that book provides that history of the violence against Indian women work nationally, and the development of Title IX in 2000, in the first reauthorization of VAWA. In 2005, tribes recognized that consultation was necessary and on an annual basis with the federal government in order to raise tribal concerns and make sure that the federal government responded to tribal concerns in a timely manner. So the second bullet there talks about, you know, the consultation was included in law because of tribes saying they wanted consultation to address the federal administration of all tribal funds and programs established under the Violence Against Women Act. Next slide, Candy, please. So the purpose, there's three specific purposes that tribes made sure they had included in Title IX of the Violence Against Women Act. And you'll see the three purposes spelled out, bulleted out on this current slide. So tribal consultation and Section 903 of Title IX specifically mandates, directs, requires the Attorney General of the U.S. Department of Justice of the government to ask for recommendations from Indian tribes on three things, minimally. One is the administration, federal administration of tribal funds and programs. So the tribes can provide feedback about whether the administration is helping Indian tribes, or if the administration of the federal funds by the Federal Office on Violence Against Women is standing in the way of tribes implementing their responses. Second is, how is the Department of Justice enhancing the safety of Indian women from the four crimes: domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, stalking, and sex trafficking? And then third, how can the federal government strengthen the federal response to such violent crime? So that's, you know, overarching why we have these annual required government-to-government consultations between the federal and tribal governments that started in 2006. So remember, it became law in 2005, and the first one was 2006, and we've had them every year since. And later on in the webinar, I believe Tammy and Shirley and Michelle are going to talk about what a difference the government-to-government consultations have made in the lives of Native women on the ground, in their tribal communities, in their villages. So I think that's it on my end. And please feel free to post questions in the GoToWebinar control panel that we'll answer at the end of the webinar. Thank you.
Okay.
Andy, next slide, please. Thank you.
The annual Tribal Consultation Report, Section 903 of VAWA 2013, mandates that the Attorney General is to submit a report to Congress on the annual consultation that, one, contains recommendations made by Indian tribes during the year covered by the report.
This is Tammy Truitt-Giroux, and the amazing thing about, because that was written into the statute under the 903 VAWA 2013 that requires the Office of Violence Against Women, which is the agency that's in charge of getting that information and setting up the annual consultation. But that report comes out every year from the actual comments and conversations that happen at the prior year's consultation. And why that's important is because that helps to build up the record, basically, of the both concerns and I think sometimes successes, but a lot of times the issues that may need to have more attention paid to that, whether that's through funding sources, whether that's through other recommendations that are made by tribal leadership at those consultations.
The annual Tribal Consultation Report also describes actions taken during the reporting year to respond to recommendations made during the year or a previous year.
And again, I want to just repeat that what's important about this is that this is guaranteeing that the tribes are being heard. And that's really important with follow-up, because oftentimes, as we all know in meetings and other things that we get involved with our tribal governments being so very busy with many, many issues that affect their communities and affect their tribal citizens, that sometimes these things can get pushed aside if other things seem to be taking a precedence. So this gives value and keeps the information current and appropriate, and it also helps when you go into the next year's annual consultation, which happens every year since 2006, to really make sure that we're, both the tribes are, the issues are coming to the forefront, but also that the federal partners are being able to take a look and really see if there's any of these things being addressed. Because sometimes you might hear the same thing year after year, so there may be something that needs to then be taken into account if things haven't been addressed appropriately.
The report also describes how the Attorney General will coordinate and collaborate with Indian tribes, Secretary of Health and Human Services, and the Secretary of the Interior to address recommendations made.
And again, we can't really emphasize enough how important that report is. Now, every tribe should be access a copy of that tribal report, but you can access that report from this prior year, 2018, on the OVW website. And again, I would really encourage any of the tribes that are considering going to the annual consultation to go over that report, just to read through it, to make sure that the recommendations are either needing to be brought back up to the forefront and or the recommendations maybe have been addressed. So it's a very important document, and it's something that we continue to encourage people to read. It's not a really, really long document, and so I think it's valuable. So next slide, please.
Tammy, this is Paula. Can I add to that as well?
Oh, absolutely.
I think so. The report became a requirement only in 2013. So that was the very last reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act. And part of the reason why it was included as an amendment within the law, within VAWA, within Title IX, as part of Section 903, is that tribes were finding that there was very little accountability on the part of the federal agencies, the Department of Justice, Department of Health and Human Services, and Interior, in regards to their recommendations and their statements at the annual consultations. So the tribes suggested and had discussions from 2005 to 2013 about how can they continue to hold these federal agencies and the federal government accountable. And the suggestion was, well, let's have them report on an annual basis to Congress on what we're discussing at consultation. So we have found that because of those annual reports, and it's only been, it hasn't been since 2006, it's only been since 2013. Because of those reports, we have found that increased attention and increased accountability of the federal agencies has also resulted in increased accountability of our federal lawmakers. So, for example, Senator Murkowski, we have seen over the years her dedication and attention to violence against Indian women has shifted because the tribes are holding everyone more accountable through these annual reports. So I'd like, Tammy, all the reports from 2013 to today are available on the Office on Violence Against Women website. And I believe Candy can confirm, if you go to the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center's website at aknwrc.org, there's a link to go to OVW. And you'll find, if you search on OVW's website, you will find their consultation report. Thank you.
And thank you, Paula. I actually forgot to mention that, but that's a really important note, because that has only been the reports have only been since 2013, but they've been really, really helpful. In fact, I keep copies of those on my desk and go back through those often for past years.
Okay, Section 903 VAWA 2013 requires the Attorney General no later than 120 days before consultation date to notify tribal leaders of the date, time, and location of the consultation to be held.
And I think important to note is that the Office of Violence Against Women really does try to get input through their tribal division. They do try to get input from the tribes in terms of location for the consultation, because they are trying, I think, to maximize the ability for tribes to participate in consultation. Now, we have for several years and just been asking that the consultation be brought to Alaska, and hopefully one of these years that will be possible, and I think that would be really valuable, because of course with 229 tribes and 40% of the tribes in the nation, we might be able to get a really active voice at the table, although we have to say that since 2015, I believe, somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, down in Seattle, or not in Seattle, but in Washington, when consultation was down there, we had a historic number of tribal leaders participate from Alaska. And it was historic, it was emotional, and it was powerful. And so I just always want to mention that, and we have had active participation since then.
This is Michelle, and I just wanted to add that the notice of annual tribal consultation, leading up to the notification, there are conference calls that tribes can participate in to weigh in about where they think the annual consultation should occur. In the past, we've really requested that OVW look to tribal facilities to use, so that we're supporting those businesses, as well as we're in lands that are favorable to us and our ancestors, and provide us a lot of strength. And so in the past, the federal government will generally come up with maybe 4 sites, and then we'll have a couple of teleconferences that everyone can participate in, and to narrow down where the event is going to occur. And so so again, while sometimes it may not be convenient to get to the location, we are supporting a tribal business, and are being hosted by a tribe, and that has been really powerful in the past. Next slide, please.
And I also just want to add, while we're going to the next slide, that I think we have pictures of past consultations, including the one from 2015 that Tammy referenced, which was historic because it did have the largest number of tribes from any one region ever participate since consultation started in 2006. And it left such a lasting impact on everybody in the room, both federal government officials and other tribal officials, that it resulted in the federal government coming to Alaska later that year for a listening, or no, it was the next year. So that was in 2015, and in 2016, the federal agencies came out and had a listening session during AFN, specifically on violence against women. So, again, all of this work has been about raising the issues for Alaska tribes and Alaska Native women and their children up to the national level, so that you're not isolated in Alaska and the rest of the country can continue to ignore your needs. And so it really has made a difference, not just physically coming, but also providing written testimony. If you're not able to make it, sending in written testimony by the deadline, which is usually 2 months after. I think they're doing it a little bit. I think they're right now at September 30th is the deadline for written consultation, but that may change. So thank you.
Thank you, Paula. Go ahead,
The significance of tribal consultation: one, provides critical opportunity for government-to-government dialogue and for Indian tribes to identify barriers and implement solutions that will enhance their capacity as governments to protect their citizens.
And we can't emphasize enough how important this opportunity is, because as tribal governments, a sovereign relationship with the other two sovereigns, whether that's the federal government or the state government that you live in, government-to-government consultation is different, because it's not just about a conversation. It's about an official, documented opportunity to have tribes stand up to say, these are our needs, identify what the barriers or gaps might be to meeting those needs, and try to then implement solutions and help acquire and get assistance as a tribal government to help in those solutions for their tribal citizens. And so that is the key here is, the bottom line is it's trying to implement change that's going to help our tribal citizens on the ground. So that is just a key piece when we kind of break it down.
Consultation also allows tribal leaders to give feedback opportunity on what works or what doesn't work, and how funds and programs are administered.
And again, going back and repeating myself again, but the important piece of the consultation, and I think the value of the OVW consultation, is the fact that tribes get to have a say about what programs may be impactful and working, and what programs might need to be, and opportunities may need to be changed or adjusted so that it can work better in the tribal communities. As we know, the tribal leaders oftentimes will bring their staff or people that are working on the ground with the tribal members that may be experiencing some of the issues we talked about, like domestic violence and sexual violence and dating violence and stalking and sex trafficking, to really try to understand what the issue is like in their home community, and how and what may be something that either can be changed or what needs to be funded more or differently in order to really impact some kind of significant change to that behavior and to sometimes to the crisis that's happening in the communities.
Tribal consultation also raises awareness on current, outstanding, or emerging issues.
And oftentimes it can be very, unfortunately, our tribal leadership their families have also experienced some of the impacts of the issues, whether they're survivors of some kind of violence or victimization, or their family members are, and oftentimes it's an emotional opportunity. I mean, it's emotional. Testimony can be very emotional because what it is it's affecting our families and it's affecting our relatives, and that's the difference when we talk about tribal government. It's our relatives that we're trying to protect, because oftentimes tribal members, you know how many relations we have within our tribes, and so it's important to hold each other up, whether we're from one tribe or to another tribe, and be able to sometimes speak for each other and be consistent in that voice.
Tribal consultation also helps to design a legal framework for change and removal of barriers, inequity, etc.
And as you know, oftentimes, particularly with the Alaska Voices that we have often stated, is that the disparity and the barriers in Alaska, for many, many different reasons, create a unique and challenging way of trying to provide services for safety, healing, and for change in policy. And so making sure that this is an opportunity for those tribal voices in their language that can be heard, and the teachings that can be significant in helping to explain and really benefit from being able to voice what the need is in our communities, and whether that's more change in law, whether that's a change in policy, whether that's a increased capacity in terms of funding, whatever that might look like for that tribe. It's really important, and we try to really emphasize that we try to hold each other up as tribal relatives throughout the country. So again, thank you. And I'm going to turn this over to Paula for the next slide.
And as we're moving to the next slide, I'm just going to thank Tammy and Shirley for the information that they've just provided. And I would just like to add that it's so important that our needs and issues are heard by the federal government. If we do not provide them with what is important to us, what are our values, what are our needs, then someone in DC who may not have much knowledge about tribes, Alaska tribes, etc., will be coming up with these brilliant ideas and trying to decide how these programs designed specifically for American Indian and Alaska Natives should be created and run. And so it's our opportunity to really voice what is important to us. Now, in a former career, I was a tribal attorney for Washington State tribe, the Tulalip tribes, and I saw just how impactful consultation in providing input to a brand new program was. And that was from VAWA 2013, the Special Domestic Violence Court jurisdiction, in which tribal governments, for the first time in years, their inherent sovereignty was recognized to prosecute non-Indians who beat up Indian women, provided the tribe could meet certain conditions. Well, what happened was that was the law, and then the federal government was asked to create regulations around how to implement that law. And the first round of regulations that the federal government put out were just so incredibly misguided. They referenced, I mean, they wanted the federal government to approve every single thing. They wanted us to jump through all sorts of hoops that were unnecessary. And they, quite frankly, forgot the government to government responsibility and what that relationship meant in creating those regulations. So many tribes, including the tribe I worked for at the time, provided specific and extensive comments on those regulations, and then offered solutions as to what could be done instead. And guess what? They listened to us, and they stripped away the pages and pages of requirements, and went back to a more basic, thoughtful, respectful government-to-government process, and which was still onerous, still difficult to implement, but it was far more respectful in the government-to-government relationship. And I think that sometimes good people who work for the federal government may not understand what the trust responsibility is, and so that's something to really press upon the folks that will be in the room, just how important that responsibility is, and to remind them that it's something that has begun from the very beginning of contact and continues throughout Indian law and policy to today, and it's something that we demand. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Paula about the platforms for change.
Thank you, Michelle, Tammy, and Shirley. And I think, so this next slide, you'll see it just has 2 lines on it in terms of platforms for change. And it's both a national and a regional. And what we mean when we say platforms for change is really, in this instance, what is it that Alaska tribes, along with your brothers and sisters in the lower 48 and in Hawaii, what is it that you can unify around in terms of priority issues that rise to the top and is true for all Alaska tribes, and that your lower 48 indigenous brothers and sisters in their nations can support, that we need to rally to change. So, for example, the harmful venatide decision in 98, I think it was, by the Supreme Court, that limited the definition of Indian country in Alaska, and basically ended up excluding many tribes from that definition. So that would, for example, be an issue that all tribes in Alaska definitely can rally around, but that your lower 48 indigenous brothers and sisters in their nations could also support you in terms of how harmful that decision was by the U.S. Supreme Court, and then figuring out together how do we what's the change to fix that harmful ruling. And so, what we mean by platforms for change is really just that, is Alaska tribes coming together and talking as nations with each other about what are the barriers that our tribal governments and therefore our Native women citizens and their children face, that we need to figure out a resolution to. So the venatide decision would be one example. And I believe, because tribes have raised the issue up of, not being able to have their lands be held in trust by the federal government, that has, risen to, again, the level of needing to organize together to make some change around that. So I think there are some things that we've had discussions around over the past 20 years that we have secured consensus with all tribes, especially in Alaska, what their barriers are. I think moving forward, we'll need to continue to have those discussions with the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center now in existence, since 2013, and then very much so with all the staff since 2015, I think, or 16. I think we really have the opportunity now to, figure out together how do we create an Alaska Native tribal government specific platform for change that all tribal governments can organize and rally around and pressure change at the federal, tribal, and state levels. So we're looking forward in the coming years with the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center of having those discussions, including at our annual unity meetings pre-AFN. So I think this one is scheduled coming up. Michelle, you might have to help me out. October 17th, I believe. It's the Wednesday before AFN.
16th, prior to AFN, yeah.
Yeah. So we ask that tribes plan to attend and come and join us. All the information will be on the website, and if you're not already signed on to the Resource Center's email list campaign, we ask you to do that, as Candy pointed out on their website. Thank you.
Next slide, please. So, preparing for a tribal consultation, there's a few logistical events that need to occur, as well as preparing mentally and the material that you will be presenting. So the first thing, of course, is to arrange for travel. And OVW, the Office of Violence Against Women, has approved tribal grantees to send up to 3 tribal officials to the OVW consultation without having to do a GAN. So if you have an OVW grant and you would like to attend this, you and 2 other individuals from your tribe can arrange for the travel without having to put in a grant adjustment notice. So Sherry Ann Moore, who is the Deputy Director for Tribal Affairs, has approved that and has provided that to tribal officials. Then you need to register. We're going to be getting into the 2 different consultations that will be occurring, but both the Office of Victims of Crime and the Office of Violence Against Women has a registration page, and you should go there and register. Third, if you are going to be speaking on behalf of on the tribe and are not an elected tribal official, then you may need a letter from your president, chief, or chairperson designating you as the spokesperson for the consultation. We do have sample letters. They're very straightforward to do that if you need that. And then also look at the framing papers. Framing papers are the issues that the federal government has determined as being important to discuss during the consultation process based on prior consultations that have occurred. And both the Office of Victims of Crime and Office of Violence Against Women have different framing papers, and we will send those out to you all via email if you do not get them on your own. But otherwise, preparing for consultation for the subject matter, it's important to review what the Violence Against Women Act has done in the past and how it's affected your tribe, your region, and has it really done the things that it was hoping to accomplish. And what do I mean by that? Well, in 2013, there was a huge tribal victory in that, again, for the first time in many years, the inherent authority of tribes to prosecute non-Indians was recognized and approved in that bill. In addition, there was money set aside or appropriated authorized for implementing the Special Domestic Violence Court jurisdiction. However, it was all tied to Indian country. And so what does that mean in Alaska? Well, it meant essentially, because of our jurisdictional challenges in Alaska, that 228 of the 229 tribes was effectively left out of the VAWA 2013 implementation provisions that were created. And so, you know, so it was kind of meaningless in some ways. But you know, but it was really, of course, we want to support the lower 48 tribes, that it was a gain for them. And, you know, the federal government can certainly learn from the lessons that those tribes have created, have experienced in their exercise of that type of jurisdiction. In addition, you know, we should look at, you know, identifying tribal or region-specific platform issues. Now, our unity meeting, as Paula mentioned, is set the day before AFN begins. And during that conversation, we often try to elicit information from all of you about what are the issues that are most pressing for Alaska tribes. And in that, we try to put together a document to summarize the issues that are important, so that you have that available for you. And the National Congress of American Indians, also in partnership with us and the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center, puts together this priority issue document so that all tribes can have those issues available to them to be able to draw from in their comments. But oftentimes, you know, you know, there's certain themes that are consistent throughout from year to year, is that we want parity in funding for tribes under the Family Violence Services Prevention Act, from the Victims of Crime Act, Violence Against Women Act, and you know, we want to be treated fairly. We don't want to have undue burdens in administering the grant programs, and we want to be able to serve our communities in ways that we know is needed and necessary. And so, you know, putting out those types of information is really important. Now, if you joined us in Fairbanks on May 1st, you will know that the Women's Resource Center did create a few templates for the Victims of Crime Act consultation that occurred, and I have those available to any tribe that would be interested in having sort of a template to use for either consultation or both. I also have sort of a fill in the blank template for tribal leaders to help organize their thoughts, and I can certainly send that out as well. So, you know, there's a few things that need to be done in preparing for tribal consultation, and I just want you all to know that if you are interested, please contact us, and we can be available to assist in some of that preparation. Next slide, please. And again, you know, as the past consultations, you know, just to summarize again, VAWA 2013 reaffirmed tribal sovereignty for Indian tribes to prosecute non-Indians in Indian country. Well, that didn't work for us. And so one thing that has been proposed is that a pilot project be created in the upcoming VAWA reauthorization. The House version 1585 included a pilot project specifically to Alaska, making a finding that because of the restrictive land settlements and Supreme Court cases, that tribal jurisdiction is difficult to define, and so it created a pilot project for Indian tribes who meet certain requirements to be able to prosecute non-Indians in the context of violence against women. And so that would be something that, you know, your tribe might want to look at and think whether or not they want to support that sort of pilot project. I know that Senator Murkowski is looking at introducing a bill on creating a pilot project for Alaska, and any comments that we provide to that would be supportive of her efforts there. So Section 904 was the implementation of special domestic violence criminal jurisdiction over non-Indians in Indian country. And that's, you know, the provision that we want to amend to include Alaska tribes and to define what the territorial jurisdiction for Indian country would be in Alaska. Section 905 was a full civil jurisdiction over everyone to issue and enforce protection orders. That section is clarified, was clarified in the past because it created confusion about, again, because of the Indian country issue in Alaska, and the language of the bill of the law referenced Indian country, so it created confusion for our tribes. Sex trafficking language is included under tribal government and tribal coalition programs and in analysis and research. That's really important because sex trafficking is, it predominantly, unfortunately, our Native girls and women are targeted for sex trafficking due to a variety of factors, including the fact that we have a very high child at risk rate of Indian girls, and those young women often are targeted for sex trafficking. There's a correlation between foster care and the potential for being trafficked sexually. So that's also really important. And then our tribal coalition program is strengthened. And maybe Shirley and Tammy could speak to the tribal coalition.
Yes, thank you, and hi to your puppy that likes to be heard as well. So I think that it's important to really understand is that tribal, trying to strengthen the tribal coalitions program, and Shirley could probably speak to that more, and I believe that the Yupik Women's Coalition is listening. They weren't able to get on the webinar. We're really fortunate in Alaska. Out of the 18 tribal coalitions in the state, we have 2 in Alaska. Again, we have a large area to cover. We need more tribal coalitions. We have 2 coalitions, Healing Native Hearts Coalition, that covers the interior tribes in conjunction and in kind of parallel to the Tanana Chiefs region. About there's what, 41 or
Around there, yeah.
Okay. Tribes, and then in the Yupik Women's Coalition, who is covers 13 tribes in the lower Yukon area. And so again, the VAWA 2013 and moving forward is really strengthening those tribal programs, because tribal coalitions were funded through formula funding after many years in VAWA 2005, I believe. And we had, I think that what the, and that was spoken about at consultation rather repeatedly, because the fact is that the state coalitions have been formula funded for many years. And so it was a parity issue and about fairness, that tribes needed to have the same access to the funding for the coalitions. So do you have anything you'd like to add?
I think that tribal consultation and the village voice, the tribal leaders' voices have helped us, because it brings forward a lot of the issues that we have. Where a lot of our tribes don't have law enforcement on the ground. There's very little access to sexual assault and other areas, and nationally it gives a voice to our concerns, that if we were speaking just to our region, a lot of it goes unheard, and it gives us a foot in the door dealing with the state coalitions and nationally also. and then moving forward, the laws that help strengthen response to our tribal women.
And Candy, if you would move the slide forward, we could talk a little bit about the 2019 issues of concern that we have heard in different forums, but the main few very, very concerning issues is tribal jurisdiction over non-Indian offenders. And Michelle touched on that, about the fact that in VAWA 2013, and it was why that VAWA 2013, there was quite a lot of work to pass VAWA 2013, specifically because of wanting tribes to have the increased authority. Basically, it's called the Special Domestic Violence Civil Jurisdiction, and includes the provisions for tribes in states with restrictive land settlements. So in 2019, the ask that's being put forward, both particularly in Alaska because of our jurisdictional challenges with the Venati decision, and even with some of the other challenges that we have over lands and the authority of our members and tribes over our lands per se. But there was also a provision in there about Maine. Maine had a restrictive land settlement statement that created some problems for Maine tribes for access for the special jurisdiction, a domestic violence civil jurisdiction. The next issue that's really critical is the disbursement of the crime victim funding and support for permanent fix. As many of you know that may be on the phone, this is the second year of the opportunity for tribes to apply for what they call the Victims of Crime funding set aside, which has been appropriated very well. I mean, it's been a very, very generous appropriation for tribes. And so there's been some difficulty, I think, in trying to sort out getting the disbursement and how to get it dispersed, and getting those programs up and running in tribes on several different kind of fronts, supposedly. But increased protection from sexual assault and services for women surviving rape. We have very minimal things in place, and there's a lot of layers to that. The layers can include things just as basic as law enforcement response, or having a responder, even a health care response, or mental health care response for sexual assault and services for women that are surviving rape. Oftentimes in our isolated communities, as we all know, those services have to be attained in the larger hub communities. Sometimes in order to attain those services, you have to call in law enforcement. And there's a law, and I'm not going to get really far into that, but the fact is that people can report their rape and even have a forensic exam without having law enforcement reporting. In rural Alaska, that's been difficult because oftentimes the sexual assault exam kits are only available through contacting law enforcement and the funding to get a forensic exam. So there can be some real gaps and barriers to getting services right away for a sexual assault victim, survivor. But then the aftercare services are pretty much non-existent. And so those are all things that are important protections that need to be addressed for those women, and I think sometimes men, that are surviving rape. Improve public safety funding mechanisms. Again, access to public safety, whether that's through a tribal COPS program, through a VPSO program, even through the Alaska State Troopers program, is that there's of course not enough Alaska State Troopers to be responding as much as we need the response. VPSOs, for many, many reasons, have not been well funded and or successfully filling empty positions. And then with the COPS program, one of the main concerns has been that tribes can apply for COPS funding, but trying to get the training, the equipment, and the support services needed for those COPS on the ground has also been a bit problematic. And so I think it's one of those kind of disparity issues that we need to discuss and talk about. The impact of, excuse me, the impact of extractive industries on the safety of Native women. Now, we understand in Alaska, having been a major state that has worked within the extractive industries, and just the, it's almost like a gold rush mentality, which has created some major concerns, both when we talk about the infrastructure of our public safety, of our accountability. I mean, just so many things. And then this is happening in the lower 48 states in many places. And so other tribes, and supporting other tribes' concerns about the extractive industries and just the toll, the heavy toll that it's taking on the safety of Native women and Native children in particular. Outstanding unaddressed issues of missing and murdered Native women. Unfortunately, again, Alaska stands out as one of the highest numbers of missing and murdered Native women. And we understand, and we're working with a lot of the other tribal communities around the nation on this issue. And it's a large issue, and it's something that has to be addressed in various ways. And so that's another issue of concern for 2019 that we're trying to bring to the forefront. And increased federal penalties for tribal protection order violations and exclusion orders. Again, that's across Indian country and Alaska Native villages that needs to be addressed in, again, various ways and many capacities. So does anyone else have anything they would like to add?
I think I would just, thank you, Tammy. I think I would just add that what you see on the screen comes from tribes. So if you don't see an issue on there that is an issue of concern for your tribe, we ask that you share that with us, because it may be an issue that other tribes share that just hasn't, risen to our attention. So these issues of concern are your concerns, tribal government's concerns. So we ask again, if you don't see something on there, particularly when Michelle or Candy are able to share prior issues of concern and the current statement that our organizations are working on, that we encourage you to consider to submit as your tribe's concerns, which many do that. Many tribes will say they have their own concerns, but they also support the concerns being raised by the National Congress of American Indians and the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center. So I just wanted to add that. Thank you, Tammy.
And this is Michelle, and I think it's also important to really focus in on what your issues of concern are, even if they have already heard that issue from other people, because this is, the cumulative effect really has an impact on those present in the consultation room, and we need to really, stress the importance of these issues. If we do not, then they will assume that there's no problem, that what they've provided is appropriate, or things like that. So just getting back to the OVC consultation that was held in Fairbanks on May 1st, we had NCI provided a consensus statement that all the tribes present reviewed and adopted, and almost every single one of them mentioned that consensus statement, either by adopting it fully or queuing in on a specific point within that document. It was just a one-page document, or even rereading it into the record. It was important for them to hear it. And one of the things that happened as a result of that, one of the consensus points was to reissue the Victims of Crime Act funding, because not enough tribes applied for the first round or even knew about it. There was a lot of confusion, etc. And so the tribes in attendance said, immediately reissue another solicitation to get that crime victim fund out to tribes, because we need it. And so they heard us, and it happened. So discussing what's important to you is really important. Next slide, please. So the OVC, Office of Victims of Crime, is also having a consultation on the day before, August 20th, at New Buffalo. And again, this is a really important consultation to have, because for years, the Victims of Crime Act, which was enacted in 1984, it included tribes and federal government to access the Crime Victims Fund, but left out tribes. And for years and years, tribal advocates, lawyers, leaders advocated for tribes to be included in the Crime Victim Fund, which is very substantial. It runs in the billions of dollars, and it comes from fines and other penalties through the federal government. So it's not tax-based, but it's paid by violators of crimes. And tribes have been left out of it up until 2018. So in 2018, we were included through an appropriations bill. And so what that means is that it was for that year, we were included only, and up to just under 140 million was allocated for tribes to receive funding. And so the program for how that fund is distributed is just being created, and we're seeing a lot of issues with it, and so it's really important that tribes attend the Office of Victims of Crime consultation, as well as the Office of Violence Against Women consultation. And so next slide, please, Candy. The Office of Victims of Crime, the agenda, as you see, there's a pre-registration, or you can register online at OVC Tribal Consultation, and that's ovwconsultation.org/OVC-tribal-consultation. And you can register there for testimony. And the consultation is all day, as you can see, and it's going to be really vital that you all are there to provide consultation or provide comments, written comments. In the framing paper that they've presented is specific about the consultation for tribal set-aside from the Crime Victims Fund for future OVC funding. Right now, they're doing competitive grants. They did one tribal set-aside in the first year. The second year, they rolled it into the CTAS, Coordinated Tribal Assistance Solicitation, without really informing anyone about what that meant. And as a result, very few people applied. And so then they did a second solicitation this year, which is open right now until August 16th. So the tribal consultation that is being, that they really want to hear about is regarding how to administer this funding in the future. And they have, what they've heard from tribes is that there needs to be some sort of formula for base funding. So they've presented, I think, 6 different formula options, and they would like some answers to specific questions that they have identified about what changes to the sample formulas would you like to see, and what factors should they consider, and should there be a cap on the amount of funds awarded, and if so, how would that be determined? And should OVC use some of the funds to establish resources or technical assistance or evaluation centers physically located in Alaska and strategic areas in the lower 48 to develop plans for addressing crime victim funds? And what other specific assistance should OVC provide to help existing programs, support innovative ideas to expand programs, and provide additional training and technical assistance? So those are the questions that they have identified, but you know, you may think that there's other questions that they've not asked, and you should address those. And so, so for instance, during a webinar that OVC had recently, a question was asked why, you know, tribes can apply for shelter funds, but the shelter, they can only request a modular home or a to renovate an existing facility. And someone asked, why can't we request construction funds? You know, because it's really hard to find existing buildings, especially in Alaska. It's really expensive to send in a modular, and you know, in certain conditions, modulars are really ill-equipped to withstand the weather that we experience. And the answer to that question was, well, OVC doesn't have the staffing to handle such a program. So they don't have the staffing to handle construction grants. Well, then, you know what? There's a trust responsibility, and there is, you know, there are other programs that they could partner with, such as HUD or other similar types of programs, to work on those types of issues. You know, it's not for tribes. Why do tribes have to tell the federal government how to coordinate with their administration's different departments? It's really on them to do that, and we need to demand that. This is our government, our tribal governments, that we are trying to create infrastructure from, based on the trust responsibility and the fact that you know, there's resources available. They need to work harder at working with what our needs are, and if they're not able to do that, then they need to expand it. Another issue that was brought up was around you know, just who is administering these programs. You know, there's not a tribal group similar to OVW. There's not a tribal deputy director. Should something like that be in place? Because, you know, we don't know the experience of the folks that are administering these OVC grants, whether they understand the trust responsibility, the government to government relationship, things like that. So, so anyway, this is an opportunity to once again help create important programs for tribal governments that will hopefully be in place for years to come. We are working on a permanent fix to make sure that we get OVC funding permanently, not just year to year. Next slide, please. So, for the Office of Victims of Crime, there is this report called Vision 21, Transforming Victim Services Final Report. And that might be a very good document for you all to review if you're feeling a little bit stuck on what you want to say for the Victims of Crime solicitation. So I encourage you to look at that if you are interested, but also I would just like to say that once again, we did create some templates for the Fairbanks consultation, and we'd be glad to share those if you are interested, and just email me. Next slide, please.
Michelle, I just want to add on the Vision 21 report that the goal for OVC's Vision 21, which That report was released 6 years ago in May of 2013. The goal of that report, per the Office of Victims of Crime, was to transform victim services, permanently alter the way we treat victims of crime in America. That was the goal, overarching goal for OVC issuing that report. And the question before tribes and Native women's advocates is really, what would we consider tribal beacons of light around victim services? So it's really the solicitations that's due for the Tribal VAWA funding is, August 16th. It's around the corner. And if you're not considering it, we do encourage you to take a look at that. And even if you are interested in providing support to your tribal citizens around, for example, alcohol and drug treatment services, which we know is a huge need among many other needs, you can do that with this funding. And thinking about, vision, what would you and your tribe like to see that is available around services for victims of crime, understanding that for Indian tribes, the first crime committed against them was the crime of colonization. So if we understand that that is the original crime against Indigenous nations, then, the list of what services you could develop to address all the issues, injustices that we see committed against tribal peoples and happening today is a large list. But just pick one at the very least and apply for those resources to address that. We do have, if you're interested in doing something like, alcohol and drug abuse treatment as an example, we do have an application that was funded in this last year that we're more than happy to share with you. And I think we've got other applications that we're also happy to share in terms of whether you would like to start a shelter for domestic violence victims or sexual assault victims or other tribal victim services. So I just want to put the plug in for that and really have us think through this Vision 21 was not focused on tribes per se, but tribal victims were included. And so there are some recommendations, but they're not as tribal focused as I would like to see them. So it's, I think, an idea for us to think about what would the vision be that's an Indigenous vision for the future. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Paula. And so the additional resources, again, and I just want to reiterate, there's also a framing paper for the Office of Violence Against Women, and there's 2 pages, 2 different framing papers. One is proposed grant funding incentives in Savannah's Act, which is the missing and murdered Indigenous women issue. They are, even though Savannah's Act is not passed, is not law yet, they're treating it as if, or what if it does get implemented. The other is increased tribal applications consultation framing papers, and that is something, how to make grant funds more accessible to tribes. And so they would like to hear from all of us on those 2 points. And so again, that's really important. We should also consider going to the OVW Tribal Consultation website, and they have every year that they've done reports listed there. That's a great resource. The other great resource is the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center Restoration magazines. There's online, there is access to those magazines, and within those magazines there is information about how to organize your thoughts and what priority issues are important for different regions. And then the Safety for Native Women, Violence Against Women Act and American Indian Tribes is a resource book that the NIWRC, Jacqueline Aktuka, an attorney who has great experience, wrote and is relevant to the issues that would be addressed, and that could also be a resource. But, really, you all have the stories in your heart. They need to hear those stories about what has happened in your communities. They need to hear about what your needs are. And so, don't feel like you have to go to these places in order to put together your comments, because you have the stories within you. A couple of years ago when I testified, I told the story about my childhood friend, Linda Guthrie, her inability, I should say, to access Crime Victims Fund after her daughter was murdered in August 2016, and just the challenges that she has faced in the years since then to provide for the 2 surviving children whose father has been convicted now of murdering Judy Lee Guthrie at age 29. And so I just sort of went into the step by step of what happened and how difficult it was for her to access funds from while living in Heidelberg, Alaska, and having to access funds hundreds of miles away in Juneau, Alaska, from people who didn't understand her situation, and just how that really re-victimizes her and her dependents. So, so I'm sure, sadly, there are many stories similar to the story of Judy Lee Guthrie and Linda Guthrie, and I have permission to tell their story and to use their story. So if you do use specific names, it would be a good idea to either get permission, or if you're using it from a news article, specify that. So anyway, if I could get Tammy and Shirley to provide some additional comments before we close.
Okay. Thank you, Michelle. Do you want to go ahead? Okay. Well, this is Tammy, and again, I really cannot, again, I keep repeating myself. This is important to our tribes and our tribal members and our tribal citizens, and these issues, sometimes it seems like the larger issues are removed from what's happening on the day-to-day and the ground. That's just not true. Having worked as a tribal administrator and tribal social worker and working in this field for well over 40 years, the differences that these issues have made and the impacts directly on our relatives in our communities really is happening. It's huge. And yet we understand and we know that there needs to be more done. And whether that's direct service, whether that's changing a law, whether that's trying to get a law enforcement officer, whether that's trying to get our tribal court active in trying to help hold accountable people that are behaving badly. I mean, those are all things that impact our day-to-day lives in our communities. We understand that and I feel this is my words only, we understand that we're under attack in our communities, whether that's drugs, whether that's alcohol, whether that's violence, whether that's the impact of vetoes in Alaska, whatever that might look like in our communities, we are under attack in terms of trying to provide sometimes basic services of housing, safety, and sometimes just down to the food and clothing. And so our voices as tribal governments, with the opportunity to have our voices heard at that level, is valuable, and it makes a difference. So that I would encourage, if and how your tribal leadership can be a part of that, whether that's through in-person consultation and or written consultation. I really encourage you to have your voices heard.
This is Shirley. I think that it's really important for our tribal leaders to either go to consultation and present issues or provide written consultation. We have 229 tribes, and if we got more tribes to submit their issues and have it documented, I think Alaska could have a big impact on ways that the laws are changed or issues are dealt with. And we're really thankful for the tribes that have sent their leaders to consultation, because it shows by the different laws and things that policies that are passed that they do listen. And this is written documentation that goes to Congress, and Congress reviews all this testimony.
Thank you very much for allowing us to present today. We really appreciate your time.
And I'm not sure, do we have any questions, or if not, just want to again reiterate that, email me if you're interested in receiving any templates, and Candy will be sending out the framing papers as well as the presentation.
And Michelle, there were no questions on the questions section, so I think you guys are good on that.
Okay, well, very good. Thank you all for joining us today. We really appreciate your time. We know how valuable it is, and we wish you well and hope to see you in New Buffalo, Michigan. Just to remind you that NCAI will be hosting a priority discussion the night before on August 19th and at the hotel. So I hope you'll join us for that event as well, and contact us if you have any questions or need some assistance. Gunis Chish Hawa.
Thank you.